While millions of people were being murdered across Europe, Heinrich Himmler was spending SS resources on something else entirely: a search for the Holy Grail. This wasn't a side project. This wasn't a hobby he kept quiet. Himmler built an entire castle to house it, a real room, in a real building, waiting for an object he believed was still out there. He sent officers into French caves to look for it. He flew to Spain himself to look for it. He assigned a government research bureau, staffed by real scientists with real academic credentials, to help track it down. He genuinely believed that finding it would prove Germanic racial superiority and hand the SS something close to supernatural power. He never found it. But the search itself, followed step by step, tells you almost everything about how this man's mind actually worked. This wasn't just a curiosity buried in the footnotes of Nazi history. Himmler had an entire castle, Wewelsburg, rebuilt to serve as a kind of SS Camelot. It had a round table. It had a crypt built for dead SS officers, complete with fittings for an eternal flame. And, according to the SS's own internal records, it had a specific chamber, reserved and waiting, for the Grail itself. Here's the key thing. This wasn't a fringe belief Himmler kept hidden from the regime's inner circle. It shaped SS ritual, SS architecture, and SS research budgets for over a decade, guided in no small part by a man the SS itself nicknamed Himmler's Rasputin. This is one of the stranger corners of Nazi occult history, and one of the dark history facts you'll find from the entire war. To understand how the architect of the Holocaust ended up chasing a medieval legend, you need to understand the ideology he built underneath it. Himmler didn't see the SS as a bureaucratic department. He saw it as a religious order. He modeled it explicitly on the Teutonic Knights, a medieval German military order that had conquered and converted the pagan Baltic through a mix of crusading violence and colonization, and on the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits whose internal discipline, strict hierarchy, and absolute obedience to a single leader he genuinely admired and studied in detail, reportedly keeping a copy of the Jesuit founder's spiritual exercises on his own bookshelf. He believed in the reincarnation of ancient Germanic kings. He believed history moved in cycles, and that the racial purity of a lost Aryan past could be recovered piece by piece, expedition by expedition, if you knew where to dig and who to trust. That belief had an institution behind it, the Ahnenerbe, the SS's own Ancestral Heritage Research Bureau, founded in 1935. On paper, it was a research organization, complete with academic-sounding departments, publication series, and university partnerships. In practice, it existed to manufacture the pseudo-archaeology that justified everything else the SS did. Its researchers didn't go looking for evidence and follow it wherever it led. They started with the conclusion that an ancient Aryan master race had once existed and was racially superior to everyone around it, and then went hunting across the globe for anything that could be twisted into supporting it. If you could prove that Aryans were a fallen master race scattered across the globe, then genocide could be reframed as restoration, and colonization could be reframed as reclamation. This is bizarre history. In the most literal sense, history so strange it resists easy belief, but every piece of it was backed by real institutions, real budgets, and real SS manpower, and a surprising amount of it traced back to the private obsessions of one deeply strange old man. The SS, in Himmler's own conception, was a knightly order, not a police force. The motto, Meine Ehre heißt Treue, my honor is loyalty, was deliberately medieval in tone. SS officers received wedding rings engraved with runes. New members went through initiation ceremonies designed to feel ancient, even though most of the actual ritual content had been invented within the past decade. Every winter, Himmler personally distributed a Yule candlestick carved with runic symbols to loyal SS men, part of a deliberate campaign to replace Christmas with a rebranded Germanic solstice festival. right down to the wording of the greetings cards. This wasn't bureaucracy dressed up in ritual. This was a cult, run with the paperwork of a state right down to the personnel files. Himmler took the medieval framing further than almost anyone around him found comfortable. He believed he was the reincarnation of Heinrich I Henry the Fowler, the 10th century king who founded the medieval German state and pushed back invasions from the east. In 1936, on the 1000th anniversary of Henry's death, Himmler organized a massive commemorative ceremony in Quedlinburg, the town where the king was buried, turning a minor historical anniversary into a full state occasion complete with torchlight processions and SS honor guards. He later arranged for the king's bones to be symbolically returned to a crypt at Quedlinburg Cathedral and established an annual ceremony there every July 2nd, the anniversary of Henry's death. A ritual Himmler treated with total, unironic sincerity for the rest of his life, attending in person whenever the war allowed it. Here's what makes this so dark. Almost none of it was Himmler's own invention. Much of the SS's mystical architecture, the runes, the rituals, the fixation on ancient Germanic kingship came from a single, genuinely bizarre source, a retired Austrian army officer named Karl Maria Wiligut. Wiligut had been a decorated staff officer in the First World War, but his descent into occultism started even earlier, when he joined a fringe esoteric group called the Order of the New Templars around 1908 and began claiming access to secret ancestral knowledge. Somewhere along the way, he became convinced he was the last living descendant of a line of ancient Germanic sages, claiming ancestral clairvoyant memory stretching back thousands of years. Memories, he insisted, that let him personally recall events from a prehistoric priesthood his family had supposedly belonged to. He developed an entire private religion around it, built on the idea that the events of the New Testament had actually happened in Germany rather than Palestine, and that Jesus Christ had really been an Aryan spiritual teacher named Christ, founder of a much older faith called Irminism. In 1924, years before he ever met Himmler, Wiligut had been forcibly committed to a mental asylum in Salzburg and formally certified insane, reportedly diagnosed with schizophrenia. He was released in 1927. None of that stopped Himmler. In 1933, a disciple introduced Wiligut to the Reichsführer SS, and Himmler was immediately captivated. Wiligut joined the SS under the pseudonym Karl Maria Wiligut, and for the next 5 years he functioned as Himmler's personal mystic, designing the rune-covered death's head ring worn by SS officers, shaping the symbolism on SS flags and uniforms, and accompanying Himmler on his earliest site visits to a half-ruined Renaissance castle in Westphalia. The SS itself later nicknamed him Himmler's Rasputin. It wasn't until 1938 that a senior SS officer, digging into Wiligut's background, discovered the asylum record an embarrassment Himmler quietly worked to bury, rather than a reason to cut him loose. In 1934, on Wiligut's urging, Himmler acquired that castle Wewelsburg for a symbolic rent of 1 Reichsmark a year. The number was deliberate. What followed wasn't. Himmler poured enormous resources into rebuilding it. Plans at one point called for a 250 million Reichsmark complex surrounding the castle, with the entire village of Wewelsburg relocated and the valley flooded to make room, transforming the whole site into a fortified compound centered entirely on the North Tower. Architects called it the center of the world. None of it, the flooded valley, the relocated villages, the surrounding compound, was ever built. To supply labor for even the renovations that did happen, the SS established a dedicated concentration camp nearby, Niederhagen, ranked as an independent main camp alongside places like Buchenwald and Sachsenhausen. Close to 4,000 prisoners passed through it, quarrying stone for a castle built to celebrate a mythical master race. More than 1,200 of them died there. Inside the castle's north tower, one finished room still stands exactly as the SS left it, the Obergruppenführersaal the hall of the SS's most senior generals. 12 stone pillars ring the room, joined by a cross-vaulted, church-like ceiling with rounded windows more reminiscent of a Romanesque cathedral than a Renaissance castle. A round oak table once sat at its center, with 12 chairs, each formally assigned to a specific high-ranking officer, each chair reportedly marked with its occupant's coat of arms, a direct, deliberate echo of Arthur's Knights of the Round Table. Set into the marble floor is a dark green, 12-spoked sunwheel, its center inlaid with pure gold. Nobody has ever found SS documentation explaining exactly what that gold and marble sun symbol was supposed to mean, or what, if anything, it was called at the time. Directly below it sits the crypt, a circular chamber, its floor lowered more than 15 feet into the tower's foundation, modeled loosely on the shape of an ancient beehive tomb. 12 stone pedestals line its walls. A gas pipe runs to the center of the floor, built for an eternal flame that may never have actually been lit. Carved into the ceiling directly above it, a swastika. According to surviving accounts, this room was meant to hold the death's head rings of dead SS officers. Roughly 11,500 of them were collected over the years, each supposedly returned to the SS upon its owner's death. What happened to most of those rings afterward is still unknown. Is that the architecture of a government department? Or the architecture of a cult, building its own private mythology, one pillar and pedestal at a time? And then there's the room that's harder to pin down, what SS records and later historians have called the Grail Room. Following Wiligut's prophecies, Himmler had a rock crystal standing in for the relic he never actually found placed at its center, a kind of placeholder for a treasure that hadn't arrived yet. Here's what makes this so strange. The SS itself left remarkably little documentation about how this room was actually used, or precisely how it related to the other two, or even exactly what became of the crystal once construction stalled. What's certain is the intention behind it. Somewhere in that castle, there was a space, deliberately built, waiting for an object that never arrived, a monument to a myth, furnished and ready, with nothing in it. Worth being honest about here. Historians who've spent careers on this material, most notably Nicholas Goodrich Clark in his study, Black Sun, note that the SS itself was oddly quiet about what these rooms meant even to its own members. The Nazis were meticulous record keepers about almost everything else. On this, strangely, they left gaps. The man Himmler eventually sent looking for that object was Otto Rahn, the most cinematic figure in this entire story. Rahn was a young German medievalist, small and bookish, who never quite fit the boorish physical mold the SS preferred. He'd been obsessed since childhood with troubadour poetry, the legends of the Cathars, and the Grail romances of medieval France. In 1933, he published a book called Crusade Against the Grail, arguing that the Grail was a real, physical object, not necessarily a Christian relic at all, but possibly a sacred stone hidden somewhere in the Pyrenees by the Cathars before their destruction in a religious crusade in the 13th century. The book sold poorly, but one of the people who read it was Heinrich Himmler. Himmler summoned Rahn to a private meeting and offered to fund his research. Rahn joined the Ahnenerbe in May 1935, and by September of that year, he was writing excitedly to Wiligut about the Grail sites he was tracking down across Germany, asking Wiligut to keep the details confidential from everyone except Himmler himself. In March 1936, Rahn formally joined the SS. He was sent to southern France to keep searching to Montségur, the last Cathar stronghold, perched on a rocky outcrop where several hundred Cathars had been burned alive after the castle finally fell in 1244, and to the network of caves scattered through the Ariège region and the Sabarthes mountains, where legend held the Cathars had hidden their treasure before the final siege. Rahn crawled through tunnels by torchlight. He mapped chambers that hadn't been surveyed in centuries. He found evidence of medieval habitation, animal bones, pottery fragments. He never found anything resembling a grail. Rahn is said to have shrugged off his own position with a kind of grim honesty. A man has to eat. It's a strange, almost pitiable thing to say about working for the SS. Undeterred by the lack of results, Himmler kept Rahn on. He sent him to Iceland to study the Old Norse sagas, a trip Rahn reportedly found so bleak and treeless that he complained loudly and repeatedly about missing the sight of a single tree. In 1937, Rahn published a second book, arguing that Lucifer had originally been a positive spiritual figure, later distorted and demonized by Christianity. Himmler loved it. He had 100 copies specially bound in pigskin and gave one as a birthday gift to Adolf Hitler. Then it all came apart. Rahn was gay at a time when the SS treated homosexuality as both a criminal offense and a racial betrayal. Himmler had quietly tolerated it for years in exchange for the books and the publicity Rahn generated. But in 1937, after what internal SS reports described as a drunken incident, Rahn was caught in a same-sex relationship, and the tolerance ran out at least temporarily. As punishment, he was assigned to guard duty at Dachau concentration camp for several months. The Grail hunter, standing watch over the very machinery of the regime he'd spent years mythologizing. Friends who saw him afterward described a man who seemed hollowed out by what he'd witnessed there. Rahn kept working for another 2 years, but the goodwill never fully recovered, and the Gestapo's suspicion of him never really lifted. In February 1939, worn down and increasingly isolated, he offered his resignation from the SS. Himmler accepted it. On March 13, 1939, almost exactly on the anniversary of the fall of Montségur, the Cathar Castle, Rahn had spent years trying to unlock the secrets of local children, found his body frozen in a ravine near Sol, in the Tyrolean Alps, 2 empty bottles beside him. His death was privately recorded as a suicide. Himmler told the rest of the SS it had been a mountaineering accident. The reality was so much stranger than either version. The man who spent 6 years chasing a legend for the SS may have been killed by the very organization he was chasing it for. The Grail search was never Rahn's project alone. It was one thread in a much larger operation, run day to day by an SS officer named Wolfram Severs, the Ahnenerbe's Reich business manager, who would later be tried and hanged at Nuremberg for his role in authorizing lethal medical experiments on camp prisoners. Under his administration, the Ahnenerbe sent expeditions almost everywhere. To Tibet in 1938 and 39, where a team led by the zoologist Ernst Schaffer measured the skulls and facial features of local people to hunt for evidence of ancient Aryan migration, and was received in Lhasa with a formal welcome from Tibetan officials, complete with an exchange of gifts. To Iceland, to catalogue the Eddas and hunt for surviving fragments of Norse belief untouched by Christianity. To the Crimea, hunting for Gothic archaeological remains left behind by a medieval Germanic tribe that had settled there over 1,000 years earlier. To Bolivia, to study the stone ruins at Tiwanaku, on the theory that lost Aryan engineers had once guided Incan builders, since in Ahnenerbe logic indigenous South Americans couldn't possibly have built something so precise on their own. To Finland, to record pagan folk chants before they died out for good. Every one of these expeditions ran on the same underlying theory, that an ancient master race had once existed, had scattered its knowledge across the globe, and that recovering the fragments would recover its power. The Grail wasn't a side quest inside that worldview. It was the ultimate fragment, the one piece, if it existed, that would prove everything else. Himmler didn't only send other people to look. In October 1940, he made the trip himself. He was in Spain that month for an ostensibly routine visit, inspecting Spanish security forces, coordinating with Franco's police, and laying groundwork for a planned summit between Hitler and Franco at Hendaye. He crossed the border at Irun on October 19th, stopped in San Sebastian as a guest of honor, toured the cathedral at Burgos, and had dinner with Franco himself. In Madrid, he was received with a full military welcome, decorated streets, and a bullfight held specifically in his honor, one he later described, apparently with total sincerity, as needlessly cruel. He toured the ruins of the Alcázar in Toledo, once the capital of the Visigothic kingdom, a detail that mattered to him precisely because the Visigoths fit neatly into his theory of ancient Germanic peoples spreading across Europe. Then in Barcelona, staying at the Ritz, Himmler's own briefcase was stolen from his hotel room overnight, reportedly containing maps of cave systems he intended to explore. Nobody has ever definitively identified the thief. Theories at the time ranged from Allied intelligence to local anarchists still active from the Civil War. The following day, on October 23rd, he pressed ahead anyway and traveled to Montserrat Abbey, a monastery built into the jagged mountains outside the city, long associated in German esoteric circles with the Grail legend. Himmler believed Montserrat was the real location of Montsalvat, the mythical Grail castle from Richard Wagner's opera Parsifal. The abbey's own leadership refused to greet him personally, a quiet act of defiance, given the Nazi regime's ongoing persecution of the Catholic Church, and delegated the job to a young monk who happened to speak German. Himmler asked to see the monastery's archives, specifically anything related to the location of the Grail, and reportedly lectured the monks on what he believed was the mountain's true pre-Christian Germanic origin. The monks told him plainly that there was nothing there. He left empty-handed and flew back to Germany that same day. It's a strange footnote almost nobody remembers. The second most powerful man in Nazi Germany, personally touring a Spanish monastery, hunting for a cup. By 1943, the war made the whole project moot. After the catastrophe at Stalingrad, construction at Wewelsburg was halted for good. A planned third floor for the North Tower meant to hold yet another ceremonial hall was never even started. The chamber built to hold the Grail stayed exactly as it had always been, empty. In March 1945, with American forces closing in, Himmler gave the order to destroy what he'd spent over a decade building. The job fell to an SS major named Heinz Marker, who arrived with 15 men and a supply of explosives that turned out to be too small for the job. They managed to blow up the castle's southeast tower and the SS guard buildings, then set fire to the rest. 3 days later, American armored units reached the site. The North Tower, the Crypt, the Obergruppenführersaal, the room that was supposed to hold the Grail survived, scorched but standing. Marker himself would go on to spend his final weeks of the war at Himmler's side, one of the 2 men still with him when British soldiers finally caught up to the group in the north of Germany 2 months later. So what if Rahn or Himmler himself had actually found something? It raises an odd theological problem the Nazi worldview never really solved. In most versions of the legend, the Grail is a Christian relic, the cup used at the Last Supper, or the vessel that caught Christ's blood at the crucifixion. And the Nazi regime, publicly and privately, despised institutional Christianity, viewing it as a foreign, Semitic imposition on the Germanic soul. Himmler's answer to that contradiction, borrowed largely from Wiligut's own private theology, was its own piece of invented mythology. Wiligut taught that the events of the New Testament had actually taken place in a Germanic homeland, not Palestine, and that Christ himself had been an Aryan spiritual teacher whose true message was later corrupted by the Church. Himmler absorbed this almost wholesale. In his mind, finding the cup wouldn't have validated Christianity. It would have validated National Socialism retroactively as the true and original faith the Church had buried and stolen from. It's a genuinely bizarre piece of reasoning, a mass murderer adopting an elaborate theological workaround, borrowed from a man once certified insane, so that a Christian relic could still fit inside a fundamentally anti-Christian ideology. And it never got tested. The chamber stayed empty, and the theory stayed just a theory. There's a strange kind of internal logic to it, though, once you accept the premise. If Christianity really was a stolen, corrupted version of an older Germanic faith, as both Wiligut and, eventually, Himmler believed it, then finding the Grail wouldn't have been a contradiction at all. It would have been a homecoming. The problem, of course, is that the premise itself was invented from nothing by a man who once claimed to remember events from 12,000 years ago. Wewelsburg still stands. Today, part of the castle operates as a museum documenting exactly what happened there, and part of it functions as an ordinary youth hostel, travelers sleeping in some cases in rooms just down the hall from where SS officers once held ceremonies modeled on Arthurian legend. The Obergruppenführersaal and the Crypt are both preserved and open to visitors. The museum's own historians are candid about how much of the original ritual use of these rooms remains undocumented. The sun wheel set into the floor has, since the 1990s, been adopted by neo-Nazi and esoteric far-right groups as a symbol in its own right. The Black Sun, even though nobody has ever established what, if anything, the SS itself called it. People still make pilgrimages to stand in that room, decades after the regime that built it collapsed. In the middle of the deadliest war in human history, the man running the machinery of the Holocaust was also building a black Camelot in a German forest, taking mystical guidance from a discredited former asylum patient, sending his officers into French caves, and personally touring a Spanish monastery, all in pursuit of a magic cup that was never going to be found. Every piece of it, the castle, the crystal, the crypt, the dead SS officer's own ring collection, was built, funded, and staffed by a real government in the middle of a real war, while the actual machinery of genocide ran a few hundred miles away. The delusion wasn't a footnote to what Himmler did. For him, it was close to the whole point.